Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something that I think we all struggle with at some point or another: procrastination. Yeah, that thing where, you should be doing one thing, but you end up, well, doing just about anything else.
Totally. And in this deep dive, we really want to understand procrastination, like what's actually going on. It's way more than just laziness or bad planning. We want to uncover the science and the psychology behind why it happens, to help you really understand it and give you some actual strategies that you can use to take control. We're going to be looking at the science behind procrastination for this one.
Okay, so to kick things off, what exactly is procrastination?
Well, at its very core, procrastination is the act of putting off tasks or decisions or actions, even when you know there are probably going to be some negative consequences. It's that gap between what you intend to do and what you actually end up doing. But a big part of it is that it's driven by a desire to avoid discomfort.
Okay, discomfort, like what kind?
Well, imagine, that anxiety that you might feel when you're facing a huge project, or the pressure of a deadline that's, getting closer and closer, or even just the uncertainty of how things are going to turn out. Often our brains try to protect us from these feelings by kind of like nudging us towards something else,
Yeah.
something easier, something that feels more pleasurable right now in the moment. So it's kind of like your brain is choosing the squirrel over the long-term acorns of your goals. Recognizing that this primal pull is happening is the first step to actually, being able to choose the acorns instead.
Yeah, I totally get that. I mean, I've definitely had that feeling of like, oh man, I have to write this report. And then suddenly I just have this urge to organize like my entire spice rack.
Exactly. And that's avoidance of discomfort in action, right? That urge to get lost in distractions like going on social media or even like suddenly taking a nap when you're supposed to be, I don't know, writing or studying. But here's the thing, and this is really interesting, that delaying actually makes those negative feelings even worse. So the closer that deadline gets, the more the stress builds and you kind of get trapped in this cycle.
A procrastination vortex, yeah. So it sounds like it's less about like, just being better at managing our to-do lists and more about being better at managing our emotions. But is there like any element of just bad planning or maybe a bit of laziness involved at all?
I mean, while time management skills definitely play a role, yeah, the real driving force behind procrastination is often, very often, emotional. The source really emphasizes that at its core, it's about trying to avoid these feelings of anxiety, fear, or uncertainty. And what's ironic is, as we've said, that avoidance actually just creates more of those feelings, more stress, more guilt.
So if we know that, usually it just makes us feel worse in the long run, why do we keep falling into the procrastination trap?
Well, I think it comes down to the way our brains are wired.
Yeah.
They are wired to prioritize those immediate rewards, that instant gratification. Think about like our ancestors, way back when, seizing immediate opportunities like for food or safety, that was crucial for survival. And those same neural pathways, they're still super active in our brains today.
Right. So it's like the brain's always reaching for the lowest hanging fruit, even if it's not, the best for us in the long run.
Exactly. And so the allure of these easier, more immediately gratifying things like checking our phones or watching just one more video, that can really easily overshadow, our focus on those longer term goals that require like sustained effort.
And fear seems to be another big factor here. The source mentions fear of failure. Can you tell us a bit more about that connection?
Yeah. So building on this idea of avoidance, right?
Yeah.
Fear is a big one, especially the fear of failure. When you're facing a really challenging task, the fear of not being good enough, that can be, it can be paralyzing. And we might hesitate to even start because we're so worried about the outcome. And then, of course, the longer we put it off, the bigger that task seems in our mind, the more intimidating. And that just makes us want to procrastinate even more.
Right. It's almost like a self-made hurdle that we keep making higher and higher the longer we wait.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's perfectionism too. I used to think perfectionists were like super productive, always striving for excellence, always delivering top-notch work.
Me too. The ones who are always so meticulous and organized and
Right. But when we're talking about procrastination, well, the source kind of paints a different picture. It turns out that unrealistically high standards can actually make people delay even starting a task. It's the fear of not meeting those expectations, the discomfort of maybe producing something that isn't perfect.
Wow, so perfectionism, which we often think of as a strength, can actually become a big obstacle.
For sure. The source highlights that perfectionists often end up putting things off while they're waiting for the perfect time to start.
Yeah.
Like the perfect inspiration, the perfect moment. But those conditions rarely come together perfectly. It's a way of avoiding that discomfort of not achieving their ideal.
So it seems like what we've learned so far is that procrastination is this like really complex interplay of emotions. That urge to avoid discomfort, our brain's reward system, the fear of failure, even those high standards of perfectionism is definitely more than just, being lazy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And reframing it,
Hmm.
thinking about it as an emotional coping mechanism like the source suggests, that's really the first step to actually understanding it and ultimately finding ways to kind of deal with it.
Okay, so now we have a better idea of what procrastination is. But to really understand how you can overcome it, we need to kind of look under the hood and see what's happening in the brain.
Right, so we touched on this a bit earlier, but there are these two key areas of the brain that are really involved here. The prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. So think of the prefrontal cortex as like the logic and planning center of the brain, and the limbic system. That's more about your emotions and your immediate desires.
Okay, so the prefrontal cortex is kind of like the strategic CEO of the brain. It's the one making the long-term plans.
Yeah, exactly. It's responsible for all those higher level cognitive functions like logical thinking, planning, self-control. It helps us set goals, come up with strategies and regulate our impulses so we can stay focused on those longer term objectives.
And then the limbic system is more like the impulsive part of the brain, the pleasure seeker.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The limbic system, that's where our emotions, our desires, those more like primal survival instincts come from. It's driven by the need for instant gratification, pleasure, comfort, avoiding pain or anxiety.
So when we're faced with a task that we'd rather not do, what happens between these two areas of the brain?
Well, there's often this like head-to-head conflict. So the prefrontal cortex might be saying, okay, we got to do this task. Let's plan it out. Let's get started. But then the limbic system, it might be like, whoa, hold on. That sounds kind of unpleasant. How about we check social media for a few minutes? Dopamine hit.
And it sounds like more often than not, the limbic system wins that battle.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's often the case. The desire for that short-term pleasure or just to avoid some kind of discomfort right now, that can often overpower, like, the more rational, future-oriented thinking of the prefrontal cortex.
Mm.
So yeah, choosing to scroll through your phone instead of starting on, I don't know, a big assignment, classic example of the limbic system winning.
The pull of distraction is strong. And the source also mentions this idea of temporal discounting. What exactly is that?
So temporal discounting, basically it means that we tend to value rewards that we can get right now, like immediately, way more than rewards that are off in the future, delayed. The limbic system, it's so focused on the present moment that it really emphasizes those immediate pleasures. And that can sometimes actually often override what the prefrontal cortex is saying, about those future consequences. Like, hey, think about the satisfaction of finishing this project on time.
Ah, so that explains why future me always ends up having to deal with the consequences of present me's procrastination.
Exactly. But the good news is this isn't set in stone. The source points out that practices like mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy, those can actually help strengthen the influence of the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
It's like training that logical part of your brain to have a louder voice.
Okay, that's definitely good to know. What about the brain's reward system and dopamine? How do those fit into this whole thing? Dopamine is that feel-good chemical, right?
Yeah, exactly. So when we do things that give us instant gratification, like checking social media or having a snack or watching TV, our brains release dopamine, just like a little reward. And this creates a cycle because the more dopamine we get from these activities, the more we want to do them, and the more likely we are to put off those tasks that don't give us that immediate reward. It's like we're training our brains to look for those quick hits of pleasure.
So this is helping me see that, procrastination, it's not like some sort of moral failing or a lack of willpower. It's a real thing happening in our brains.
Right. And it's about learning how to work with our brains instead of trying to just fight them with willpower alone.
So moving on from like the biological stuff to the more psychological side of things, it seems like there's a lot more going on emotionally with procrastination than, just what's happening in our brains at that moment.
Definitely. As the source highlights, we might see the behavior, the putting things off, but the real causes often have to do with our emotions, how we see ourselves, and, even sort of our deepest fears.
And we talked about fear of failure a bit earlier. It seems like that's a pretty big theme here.
Yeah, for sure. That fear of not living up to our own expectations or what we think other people expect from us,
Yeah.
that can be, incredibly paralyzing. And just the thought of not doing well or making mistakes, that can cause a lot of anxiety. And so procrastination becomes a way to kind of escape that pain, at least for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
But as we've said, avoiding it actually tends to just make that anxiety worse over time.
Right.
So it's kind of like, that monster under the bed. The longer you avoid looking at it, the bigger and scarier it seems to get.
That's a perfect analogy. And then there's this like fear of imperfection, which it sounds similar to fear of failure, but, also different.
Yeah, it's definitely related, but it's got its own thing going on. It's like this pressure to be flawless, to achieve some crazy high standard. For someone who's dealing with this, the idea of doing something that isn't absolutely perfect, that can feel unbearable. So they've put off even starting just to avoid that feeling.
Wow. So perfectionism, which a lot of people admire, can actually become a real roadblock.
Totally. The source actually says that perfectionists often delay tasks while they're waiting for that perfect time, the perfect mood, the perfect setup, like everything has to align perfectly. But of course, that rarely happens in real life. It's like trying to dodge the discomfort of not reaching this, impossible ideal.
And then there's this other thing, this tendency to self-sabotage. Why would we put things off if we actually want to succeed?
Right. It's kind of strange when you think about it, but often it comes from this feeling, maybe deep down, that we don't deserve success. Or sometimes there's even a fear that if we do succeed, then bad things might happen. Like maybe it'll be more pressure or higher expectations, or maybe it'll expose, things we feel insecure about. So it's like procrastination becomes a way to like subconsciously stop ourselves from achieving that success, kind of like running away from something that, on the surface we actually want.
So all of these underlying triggers, fear of failure, fear of imperfection, perfectionism, self-sabotage, they all contribute to that negative feedback loop we talked about earlier, right? The delay just leads to more fear and anxiety, which just makes it harder to even get started.
Exactly. The key takeaway here is realizing that procrastination, a lot of the time, it's coming from these deeper fears, these emotional responses. It's not just about being lazy or unmotivated.
It sounds like understanding those underlying emotions is crucial to breaking free from the cycle. So we live in a world that's, just overflowing with instant gratification. How does that constant access to immediate rewards affect our tendency to procrastinate?
That's a huge factor. The world we live in now, it's designed to amplify that drive for instant gratification. We have access to entertainment, social media, food delivery, all of it, right at our fingertips.
It's like we're constantly being offered dessert before dinner.
Exactly. And as we talked about earlier, our brains are wired to go for those immediate pleasures. It's like an evolutionary thing, Back in the day, it was all about survival. If you saw food, you ate it. But now, those same brain circuits, they're kind of fighting against our ability to think about long-term goals and delayed rewards.
Right, because now we know that grabbing the first cookie we see might not actually be the best choice in the long run.
Exactly. And that's why something as simple as scrolling through social media or binge watching a show can feel so much more appealing than, working on something that's going to pay off later, but requires more effort right now.
So learning to delay gratification, that's a really important skill in this kind of environment then.
Super important. And it's getting harder and harder, with all the stuff going on in the digital world.
Mm.
Think about it. There are all these things fighting for our attention. Notifications, likes, new videos to watch. It's like a constant stream of things that are designed to make us feel good right now.
Hmm.
And that makes it even harder to focus on the stuff that's going to give us a reward later.
And I know the source also talked about something called decision fatigue.
Yeah, and that plays a role too. Think about how many decisions we make every single day, right? Some of them are small, some are big, but it all adds up. And after a while, we get mentally exhausted. It's like our brain gets tired of making choices, and that can make us more likely to just give in and do something easy and fun instead of forcing ourselves to make more decisions,
Yeah.
like how to start a project, what to focus on first, things like that.
So instead of trying to figure out how to tackle that big project, we just decide to watch another episode of our favorite show.
Yeah, exactly. Procrastination becomes this way of avoiding those, energy-draining decisions that come with actually doing the work.
So what are some ways to actually, reduce decision fatigue?
Well, the source mentions a few things that can help. One is to simplify your daily routines, so you don't have to make as many decisions in the first place, like maybe plan out your meals for the week or pick out your clothes the night before. Another is to try to automate decisions whenever you can. So maybe you use a scheduling app to manage your time or set up email filters to sort your inbox. And it also helps to try to do your most important tasks early in the day when you have the most mental energy. And of course, taking breaks throughout the day can help your brain recharge so you don't get so drained.
It's like creating more structure in your day so you don't have to think so much about all those little choices. You can save your mental energy for the stuff that really matters.
Exactly.
So we've talked a lot about how procrastination is connected to things like fear and perfectionism. But it seems like stress and anxiety can also really make us more likely to procrastinate. How does that work?
Yeah, well, when we feel stressed or anxious, our bodies release this hormone called cortisol, right? And that triggers that fight or flight response. And that response is basically telling us to run away from whatever's stressing us out. And sometimes that thing we're trying to run away from is, well, the task itself.
So it's like our body is trying to protect us, but in doing so, it's actually preventing us from doing the thing that we need to do.
Exactly. And that's how we end up in that negative feedback loop. We avoid the task to get some temporary relief from the stress, but then the task is still there, looming over us. And as the deadline gets closer, the stress and anxiety just get worse and worse.
Yeah, it's like digging yourself into a deeper and deeper hole. And that fear of failure, of making mistakes, that can be even more intense in high-pressure situations, like at work or school, right?
Right.
And instead of facing that fear head-on by actually doing the work, we procrastinate, which just allows the fear to grow even bigger.
Right. And then, as the deadline gets closer and closer, that stress can make us panic and try to do everything at the last minute. And of course, when we're rushing, we don't do our best work. And then that subpar work can actually make us even more anxious about facing similar tasks in the future. So it's this self-perpetuating cycle of stress, procrastination, and then more stress. And the source even suggests that for some people, procrastination can become their go-to way of dealing with these intense emotions. It's like a learned response to stress.
It's not even about not liking the task. It's about trying to manage the bad feelings that come with it.
Yeah, exactly. That's why it's so important to learn how to deal with those underlying emotional triggers. Things like mindfulness, stress reduction techniques, those can be really helpful in breaking this cycle.
We talked a bit about perfectionism and procrastination earlier, but it seems like the source really emphasizes this link.
Yeah, and it's an important one because perfectionism and procrastination, they often go hand in hand, and that creates this really tricky cycle to break.
Yeah.
Perfectionists often set these extremely high standards for themselves, and the fear of not meeting those standards can be totally paralyzing. It can stop them from even starting a task because they're so worried about it not being perfect.
It's like waiting for all the stars to align perfectly before they can even begin.
Right. And as we've talked about, that perfect moment, it rarely ever comes.
So the key here is learning how to manage your emotions. Because procrastination, in this case, it's often a way to avoid feeling like you're going to fail or that you're not going to be perfect. But ironically, the source points out that trying to avoid those feelings actually makes them stronger over time.
So it's like you're trying to avoid feeling bad about yourself, but because you're not doing anything, you actually end up feeling worse. Exactly. And the thing is, perfectionists often want to do really good work, but all that self-criticism and worrying about every little detail can actually stop them from getting anything done. They get stuck in this all or nothing kind of thinking. If you can't be perfect, why even bother trying?
And that kind of thinking just makes it impossible to even get started. So the source is saying it's important to challenge those beliefs and to start focusing on making progress instead of always aiming for perfection. It's about learning to accept that you're not going to be perfect all the time and that making mistakes is actually a chance to learn and grow.
Right, it's about shifting the focus away from this like ideal outcome that might not even be possible, and instead focusing on the actual process of working, learning, and moving forward.
It's about taking action and knowing that it's okay if it's not perfect right away.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective can be really freeing for perfectionists who are struggling with procrastination.
Okay, so let's move on to something that seems a bit more, well, concrete, more actionable. Time management. How does not being good at managing our time contribute to procrastination?
Oh, time management. That's a big one. If you don't manage your time well, it can definitely set you up for procrastination. When you're feeling overwhelmed by like a ton of tasks or a huge project, it's easy to just feel lost. And when you feel lost, you're more likely to put things off. It's like looking at this like giant messy desk, you don't even know where to start.
Yeah, I get that. It's like looking at a puzzle, but all the pieces are scattered everywhere and you don't even have the picture on the box to help you.
Exactly. And the source talks about something called the planning fallacy, which is basically that we all tend to underestimate how long it's actually going to take us to do things. We think we can get things done faster than we actually can.
Yeah.
So we put things off, think we have plenty of time, and then bam, we find ourselves scrambling to get it done at the last minute.
Oh, I know the planning fallacy all too well. Oh, this will just take me an hour, I say, 5 minutes before the deadline.
I think we all do. And another time management mistake that contributes to procrastination is not breaking down those big, overwhelming tasks into smaller, more manageable chunks. We've talked about how huge projects can feel really intimidating, right? And that feeling can lead us to avoid even starting.
So, breaking things down into smaller steps can make the whole thing feel less scary. What are some other time management tips that can help us beat procrastination?
Well, the source emphasizes a few key things. One is to set clear goals for yourself, both for the long term and the short term. That gives you a sense of direction and purpose. Creating realistic timelines is also important. If you set unrealistic deadlines, you're just setting yourself up for stress and failure. It's much better to give yourself a bit more time than you think you'll need. And then, like we just talked about, break down those big tasks into smaller, more digestible steps. That way you can focus on one piece at a time and it won't feel so overwhelming.
It's like creating a roadmap for yourself so you don't feel lost along the way.
Right. And it's also really helpful to figure out what time of day you're most productive and try to schedule your most important tasks for those times. Some people are morning people, some are night owls. Figure out what works best for you. And then make sure you're regularly checking in on your progress. This can help you stay motivated, and it also allows you to make adjustments to your plan if you need to.
It's about taking charge of your time and being intentional about how you use it.
Exactly. Don't let the day just happen to you. Be proactive, prioritize effectively, and you'll be much less likely to fall into that procrastination trap.
We talked about decision fatigue earlier in relation to instant gratification, but how does it specifically contribute to procrastination?
Well, as we mentioned before, decision fatigue happens when we've made too many choices. Our brains get tired. And when we're faced with a task that requires us to make a lot of decisions, like how to start, what to prioritize, what resources to use, that decision fatigue can make us feel like we just can't even think straight.
So instead of making the effort to decide how to start that complicated project, we just decide to watch another YouTube video.
Yeah, exactly. procrastination becomes an easy way out of having to make those decisions.
So how do we prevent decision fatigue from taking over and leading us down that procrastination path?
The source suggests a few things. One is to try to simplify the decisions you make every day. You know, create routines so you don't have to think about as many things, like plan out your meals for the week, lay out your clothes the night before, things like that. Another strategy is to automate decisions whenever you can. Use apps or tools to help you manage your time and tasks. You can even set up canned responses for emails that you send frequently. And as we talked about before, try to prioritize your most important tasks for early in the day when your mental energy is highest. And, of course, take breaks throughout the day to give your brain a chance to rest.
It's about freeing up mental space for the stuff that really requires our focus and decision-making power. Let's go back to dopamine for a minute. It seems like this, tiny little neurotransmitter plays a surprisingly big role in our tendency to procrastinate.
It really does. Dopamine is like the fuel for our brain's reward system. When we do things that give us that immediate gratification, our brains release dopamine, and that makes us feel good, which reinforces those behaviors.
So the more we do those instantly gratifying things, the more we crave them, and the harder it becomes to motivate ourselves to do the things that don't give us that immediate reward. It's like our brains are wired to go for the quick and easy pleasure, even if it means putting off the stuff that's actually important.
Right. So the question is, how can we use this knowledge about dopamine to our advantage? How can we hack the system, so to speak, and trick our brains into being more motivated to tackle those less immediately rewarding tasks?
Okay, so the source offers a few really interesting ideas here. One is to give ourselves small rewards for completing parts of a task. So like break down a big project into smaller chunks and then give yourself a little treat or take a short break after you finish each chunk. That way you're getting those little bursts of dopamine as you go, which can help you stay motivated. It's like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for yourself, little rewards to keep you moving forward.
I like that analogy. It's about creating positive associations with those tasks that might not be inherently enjoyable. Another strategy that can be surprisingly effective is gamification. So, like turning tasks into challenges or creating a point system for accomplishing things. It sounds a bit silly, but it can actually work.
It's about making it fun, right? Adding a little excitement to the process.
Exactly. By incorporating those small rewards and game-like elements, you can actually start to associate those tasks with a sense of pleasure, which can boost your motivation.
So we've covered a lot about the biological and psychological factors that contribute to procrastination. But the source also emphasizes this connection between procrastination and something called emotional regulation. Can you explain what that is and how it plays into all of this?
Yeah, this is a really important point. Emotional regulation is basically our ability to manage our emotions, to deal with our feelings in a healthy way. And as we've been talking about, procrastination is often triggered by negative emotions. Things like anxiety, fear, frustration, boredom, self-doubt, all those feelings that we might associate with certain tasks.
So when we procrastinate, it's often because we're trying to avoid those uncomfortable feelings.
Exactly. It's a way of escaping those emotions, at least temporarily. But as we know, that relief doesn't last very long, and it usually just leads to even more negative emotions down the road.
So it seems like building our emotional resilience is crucial to overcoming procrastination.
Absolutely. The source highlights the importance of mindfulness. Learning to pay attention to our emotions without judging ourselves for having them. This can help us avoid getting swept away by those feelings and making impulsive decisions. And cognitive behavioral therapy can also be really helpful. It can teach us how to identify and challenge those negative thoughts that are connected to certain tasks, and it can help us develop more realistic and positive beliefs about our abilities. And then, of course, there's self-compassion. Treating ourselves with kindness and understanding, instead of beating ourselves up when we do procrastinate, can make a huge difference.
It's about being more accepting of ourselves and understanding that everyone struggles with this stuff sometimes.
Exactly. When we're kinder to ourselves, it's easier to face those challenging tasks without feeling overwhelmed by shame and guilt.
It's clear that procrastination can have a serious impact on our mental health. Can we talk a bit more about those effects?
Definitely. The source is very clear about the fact that chronic procrastination can have some pretty serious long-term consequences for our mental well-being.
Yeah.
We're talking about constant stress from those tasks that are always hanging over our heads, guilt and shame from not meeting our obligations, anxiety about looming deadlines, and that fear of failure that just keeps getting bigger.
It sounds like a recipe for feeling really awful.
Yeah, it is. And the source even suggests that chronic procrastination might contribute to depression in some cases. You know, that feeling of hopelessness and helplessness that can come from feeling like you're just stuck and can't make any progress. And as we've been talking about it, it often becomes this vicious cycle. The negative emotions make our mental health worse, and then the worse we feel, the more we procrastinate.
So it's really important to recognize when procrastination is starting to affect our overall well-being and to take steps to address it.
Absolutely. And in those situations, the source recommends seeking professional help. You know, talking to a therapist or a counselor can be really helpful. And cognitive behavioral therapy, like we mentioned before, can be especially effective in helping us change those negative thought patterns and emotional responses. And it's also important to prioritize self-care. Things like exercise, spending time in nature, practicing relaxation techniques, these things can all help to reduce stress and improve our mood.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the why of procrastination, but what about the how? What are some things we can actually do to overcome it?
The source suggests a bunch of practical strategies that you can use to get a handle on procrastination. A lot of them focus on organization, motivation, and creating structure. One of those effective strategies is breaking down those big, overwhelming tasks into smaller, more manageable steps. This makes the whole thing feel less daunting, and it's easier to get started when you're just focusing on one small piece at a time.
Right, it's like instead of trying to climb a mountain all at once, you're just focusing on taking one step at a time.
Exactly. And setting deadlines for each of those smaller steps can help you stay on track. It's like creating a series of mini deadlines for yourself, which can help you maintain momentum and avoid getting bogged down. Another important thing is to create a dedicated workspace for yourself, a place where you can focus without distractions. Turn off those notifications, put your phone away, do whatever you need to do to minimize those tempting distractions.
And I know the Pomodoro technique is another popular one. You work for a set amount of time, like 25 minutes, and then you take a short break.
Yeah, the Pomodoro technique is a great way to stay focused and prevent burnout. Those structured work intervals, followed by short breaks, can help you stay engaged without getting mentally exhausted. And don't underestimate the power of accountability. Tell a friend or a colleague about your goals and ask them to check in with you on your progress. Sometimes having that external support can be all the motivation you need. And finally, we've talked about this a lot, but it bears repeating. Practice self-compassion. Be kind to yourself, especially when you do slip up and procrastinate. Beating yourself up is just going to make you feel worse, and it's not going to help you get back on track.
It sounds like overcoming procrastination requires a multifaceted approach. We need to address those practical time management things, but we also need to deal with those underlying emotional factors that are driving the procrastination in the first place.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's about finding what works best for you, and being patient with yourself. It takes time to change these habits, but it's definitely possible.
The source spends a lot of time